The Olympus E-M1 Mark II was released back in 2016. Now, at the time, this cost around $2,000. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $600. That's how much I paid for this one right here. So just what do you get with this 6-year-old camera? Well, there's a 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, 5-axis in-body image stabilization, and a 121-point hybrid autofocusing system. Build quality of the E-M1 Mark II is phenomenal. You know, you've got this really sturdy magnesium alloy design, and you have all these physical buttons and dials all around the camera. And most importantly of all, this is one of those cameras that feels really comfortable in the hands. E-M1 Mark II is kind of funny. It's sort of a big little camera, or a little big camera, whichever way you prefer to think of it. You know, it's not that big when you compare it to a modern mirrorless full frame camera, but at the same time, it's way more comfortable to hold than something like, say, an EM10 Mark II. This is a really good feeling camera. Alright, for the rest of the video we'll be filming on the Olympus itself, and one of the first things I want to talk about is autofocus. Autofocus on the E-M1 Mark II is literally some of the best autofocus I've seen out of micro four thirds. You know, it's not quite on par with Canon dual pixel autofocus or Sony phase detect, but it is really good. That's part of why I've filmed this channel with this camera for so long. Is I like having a camera that I can trust, where I just hit record, step in front of the camera, start talking, and I don't have to worry about it being in focus at all, because the Olympus has it in focus. You know, the E-M1 Mark II never gets distracted, it never hunts, it always just seems to know what you're doing. You know, it's slightly slower than, say, what you're going to get out of Canon or Sony, but having said that, the accuracy is still there. You know, I first started realizing how much I trust the E-M1 Mark II when I had the idea to film those bits where, when I talk about the build quality of the camera, I hold the camera up in front of the lens and then pull it back and it sort of reveals my face and I keep on talking. You know, the first time I tried that with this camera, I was really surprised because I'd kind of just associated that with Sony's like product showcase mode. I didn't realize that the Olympus was actually capable of that. But in the past year of filming nearly every single YouTube video on this channel with this camera, I've come to trust this camera more than anything. Which brings me to my next point of why I love the E-M1 Mark II so much, and that's reliability. You know, a while back I got hired to do this corporate event. I had to do both photos and video, and I was working alone. It was just me. It was kind of an important event. It was the Neurosurgery Awards for the Mayo Clinic. And I had the E-M1 Mark II plus 2 other cameras with me, and I noticed that throughout the course of the night, I just used the E-M1 Mark II. That camera just never left my hand that entire night. It kind of brings me to what I always say on this channel about, you know, spec sheets are great, but I'm also, as an introvert, fascinated by the things that you'll never find on the spec sheet. And that's kind of it, you know. You're not going to find reliability on a spec sheet. You're not going to find that sort of intangible quality of, hey man, I'm kind of nervous here at this important event, but I trust this camera. You know, I feel comfortable with this camera. I know this camera's not going to let me down. There's no way to qualify that experience in a left brain, logical, linear, rational, analytical kind of way, so it's never going to make its way onto a spec sheet. But for me, that's a huge part of why I like a camera. Another reason why I've filmed with the E-M1 Mark II so much is that Olympus color science. You know, in a world where we drone on and on about Canon colors, or how Sony's finally starting to catch up with their color science, or Fuji, well, Fuji looks amazing. But people just kind of like forget about Olympus, and it's funny, for me personally, the Olympus colors just kind of work with the way that I color grade. I've always kind of been nostalgic for the way things looked back in the 70s when I was a kid, and some part of me is just always trying to recreate that look and feel, and I've noticed that Olympus comes closer to that vibe than any other camera system. You know, I've tried it with Canon and it does okay, and even recently I've been trying it on Sony. You know, that lens review that was right before this, that video was actually filmed on the Sony ZV-E10. I can do it okay on Sony and Canon, but I can't quite find that sweet spot the way that I can with Olympus. In terms of image stabilization, the E-M1 Mark II has 5-axis in-body image stabilization and digital stabilization as well. You know, I've got to say, the stabilization on the E-M1 Mark II is some of the best image stabilization that I've ever used. Especially when you add the digital stabilization. I mean, it makes it look like it's literally on a gimbal. You know, it's funny because I've got a handful of other cameras that when you use the electronic image stabilization, it actually kind of ruins the image instead of enhancing it. You know, a lot of times when I'm filming with like the Sony ZV-10, that electronic stabilization has just so much rolling shutter, or the Canon M50, that electronic image stabilization just has this weird like jerky effect. Like if you're panning from side to side, it kind of pans and then it jumps and then it kind of pans some more and jumps again, and it's just like, that whole footage is kind of unusable. On the E-M1 Mark II, that electronic stabilization combined with that 5-axis in-body image stabilization, it's just incredibly smooth. You know, 99% of the B-roll that I film on this channel is always with the Olympus E-M1 Mark II just because it's so smooth and so reliable. The other thing that always kind of blew me away with how good this stabilization is even at like longer focal lengths. You know, I'll film a lot of B-roll at like 45 millimeters at f1.8, and that's a 90 millimeter full frame equivalent, and like, I'm just filming it handheld. I have no problem filming a full-on telephoto focal length handheld on this camera. And in terms of video, the E-M1 Mark II does 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second and 1080p at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. The funny thing about video on the E-M1 Mark II is it has a ton of video features that Olympus just doesn't advertise. Their cameras are always kind of pushed as like photography first and plus they do video, but there actually are like a lot of very useful video features on this camera. You know, for example, in 4K mode, you've got 100 megabits per second, but you also have Cinema 4K at 237 megabits per second. Now, I know in DP Review, they say that they're not so sure you're actually getting a full 230 megabytes a second every single time you're using it. Having said that though, you're still getting really good looking 4K footage out of this camera. And 1080p is the same way. You've got an option of fine and super fine. Fine is a lower bit rate and super fine is 52 megabits per second. And you even have an S&Q mode, which Olympus just does not advertise. But there actually is built-in slow and fast modes on this camera. You have to dig deep in the menus, whereas admittedly, even someone like me with a bunch of Olympus cameras, I had to search until I really found where that setting is. But once you find it, it's actually pretty useful. You can do in-camera slow motion and in-camera fast motion. And on top of that, it allows you to choose the bit rate for the output. So if you're filming in 30 frames per second, then you can just output that footage into a 30 frames per second file. Same thing for 24 frames per second. Just output your slow motion or fast motion footage into a 24 FPS file. But most important of all, I just like the way the footage looks from the E-M1 Mark II. I mean, even for someone like me as a camera collector with I don't know how many cameras at this point, I've still spent the better part of this year filming every single YouTube video with the E-M1 Mark II, and that says a lot. Of course, that begs the obvious question, is the E-M1 Mark II worth it in 2022? And, you know, for me, the answer is a million billion % yes. You know, as far as price goes, this is a camera that falls a little bit on the higher end of the budget camera spectrum, but still, you are getting so much out of this camera. You know, you've got excellent build quality, you've got really good color science, you've got images that look good just straight out of camera, you have excellent 4K video, you've got a fully articulated screen, you've got a mic input, you have a flat image profile if you need it for video. For someone like me, from my perspective, this camera literally does every single thing that I need it to do. So I would say, yeah, you know, if you've even been just remotely curious about the E-M1 Mark II, do not be afraid to check this camera out. Anyway, I think that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.